The moment I found my late husband's handwritten warning and my original partnership agreement sewn into the lining of a ribbon sample book, I could see the ending as clearly as a finished seam. My sister-in-law would be sorting antique glass buttons by size, the name of my shop emblazoned on a smock across her chest, Unraveled Promises. Every button card she filled would bear the official docket number of her fraud conviction. My name is Laurie, and I am 57 years old. For 30 years I earned my living as a theatrical tailor, building costumes that had to survive 8 shows a week without a popped seam or a crooked hem. That trade taught me how to read fabric grain and how to unpick a lining without leaving a trace, 2 skills that ended up saving my life. My husband Tom was the quiet architect of our retirement, a structural engineer who balanced spreadsheets the way I balanced pattern weights. He always said, "Trust but verify, and if it really matters, sew a second copy into the lining." He had been dead almost 2 years when the vultures finally showed up. After Tom's heart attack, I found myself with a modest IRA worth $110,000 and a house that felt like a mausoleum. The silence in every room was so thick I could almost stitch it. I had not touched the IRA, leaving it to sit in a conservative bond fund because I could not bear to make any decisions in those first foggy months. I spent my days reorganizing my sewing room, oiling my old singer, handling the ribbons Tom had given me over the years. My sister-in-law Elaine, Tom's younger sister, came around with her husband Mark, carrying a gourmet coffee cake and a business plan that would consume the next 2 years of my life. Elaine had spent 20 years schmoozing in the fashion district, selling trims to designers, and she told me the market for antique glass buttons and silk passementerie was exploding among couture houses that wanted provenance. She had a line on an estate collection in Lyon, France, 300,000 buttons and 800 yards of handmade trim dating back to 1840. The estate was being liquidated, and the executor wanted cash. No financing, no installments. I had the IRA. She had the contacts, the supplier relationships, the glossy pitch deck. If I liquidated the retirement account and funded the acquisition, we would split the business 55% to me, 45% to her, and I would receive free custom trim for my granddaughter's wedding dresses whenever that day came. My 2 granddaughters were 12 and 9 at the time, but I had already promised them that I would trim their gowns with something meaningful, something inherited, not something bought off a rack. We sat at my kitchen table, and Elaine produced a notarized partnership agreement typed on heavy linen paper. A notary she knew from her building, a woman named Patricia, had stamped and signed it. I read every clause. On the surface it looked legitimate. Percentages, roles, exit clauses, I signed. Tom had been gone 6 months, and I thought throwing myself into a creative venture would fill the hole he left. It did for a while. The collection arrived in 12 wooden crates lined with acid-free tissue, packed by a specialty logistics firm in Marseille. I can still smell the faint lavender that clung to the wood. For 2 years I catalogued every item, grading the iridescent luster of each pressed glass button under a magnifying lamp, sorting silk gimp braids by twist count and die lot, and mounting sample cards for our online lookbook. I handled buttons made of Czechoslovakian glass with hand-painted floral centers, Victorian jet buttons carved like tiny mourning brooches, and delicate mother-of-pearl discs that changed color under different light. I learned the difference between a 4-hole sew-through and a self-shank, between French ombre silk and Italian picot-edged ribbon. It was quiet, meditative work, the kind that lets you grieve while your hands stay busy. My granddaughters would visit and run their fingers over the buttons, already dreaming of their future dresses. Elaine handled the sales calls, the website, the glossy Instagram posts. She would flutter into my workroom wearing a crisp blazer and heels that clicked on the hardwood, snap a photo of a tray of jet beads with her phone, and leave me to the labor. She would say things like, "You're the artisan, I'm the visionary," as if that excused the fact that she never touched a single button. Mark handled the books from their home office, processing payments and filing quarterly taxes through a limited liability company they had set up in both our names. I never questioned it because the orders trickled in. My granddaughter's future dresses felt secure, and I still had my old singer and my quiet grief. I trusted them because they were family, and because Tom had never explicitly warned me about Elaine. He had only ever said she was ambitious, a word I now understand carries a serrated edge. 18 months in, the business had built a small but steady reputation. Then Elaine burst through my door on a Tuesday morning with news that would unravel everything. A Parisian fashion house, Maison Dubois, wanted the entire button library for a retrospective collection celebrating the bicentennial of their founding. They were offering $590,000. Elaine's eyes were luminous. The the kind of high-wattage brightness that looks like joy but is actually greed. She said she had already spoken to their buyers, flown to Paris to meet with the creative director, and drawn up a preliminary sale agreement. She needed me to sign a dissolution of our partnership so she could handle the transaction as the majority stakeholder. She said this was because the French corporate structure required a single seller entity, and since she had the client relationships, it made sense for her to be that entity. I would receive a generous settlement for my early-stage contribution, which she described as a threadbare loyalty bonus. The phrase alone should have raised every alarm, but I was still operating on trust. I told her I wanted to read whatever documents she had first. She laughed and said, "Of course, sweetheart, you're so meticulous, just like Tom." The mention of his name hit me like a needle through the finger. I nodded, and she said she and Mark would bring the paperwork that evening. They arrived at my house with a leather portfolio. Mark wore a suit that cost more than my first sewing machine, a charcoal grey brioni with a pocket square folded into a precise peak. His cologne was sharp and synthetic, the scent of someone who believes money can mask character. They sat me on my own sofa and slid a stack of papers across the coffee table. The top sheet was a certification of dissolution and asset transfer, asserting that Elaine was the sole owner of the button collection because my initial investment had been treated as a personal loan, not equity, and that the loan had been fully satisfied. In consideration for my advisory role, they were granting me a $3,800 store credit at their future online trim outlet. The credit was labeled Threadbare Loyalty Bonus. Mark explained it with the kind of smile that makes your skin shrink, the smile of a man who has spent years perfecting the art of legalized theft. Elaine patted my knee and said, "We wanted to make sure you were taken care of, Laurie. You've been so fragile since Tom, and we didn't want to burden you with messy business details." I felt my face go slack, not from sadness, from the effort of keeping my rage below the surface. I had been a union shop steward for years in the theatre district, negotiating contracts and spotting contract loopholes. I knew a fraudulent dissolution when I saw one. The $3,800 was not even 1% of the value of the buttons I had personally funded. I told them I needed a day to think, that my head was foggy from my blood pressure medication. Elaine's expression flickered, some mix of relief and contempt. Mark said, "Of course, take all the time you need. The offer expires Monday, so we'll just need your signature by Sunday evening." They stood and gathered their things. While they were there, Elaine wandered into my sewing room, snooping as she always did, and came back carrying the ribbon sample book I kept on my nightstand. It was a thick, hand-bound ledger of vintage silk ribbons, each page layered with swatches from Tom's travels over the decades, a gift from him on our 10th anniversary. She flipped through it with a dismissive sneer, her manicured nail catching on a piece of antique passementerie. "Old junk," she said. "You should donate this to a textile museum, free up space. It's just collecting dust." She dropped it in the cardboard box by the door where I was gathering donations for the church rummage sale. I said nothing, my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth would crack. They left with their portfolio, and the moment their taillights vanished down the street, I pulled the sample book from the box. It was late, nearly 10 o'clock, but I carried it to my work table and sat under the task lamp. I had handled that book 100 times over the years, always just to admire the ribbons. I had never thought to look beneath the surface, which I realized was exactly the lesson Tom had tried to teach me. That night something felt different. The spine was slightly thicker than I remembered, maybe 1/8 of an inch, and when I ran a fingernail along the inside back cover, the paper lifted near the corner. Somebody had glued a false end paper over the original board, but the glue was old and brittle, yellowed with age. With a seam ripper, I gently separated the layers, working the blade at a shallow angle so I would not tear anything. The false paper came away with a soft, dry crackle. Inside was a flat pocket made of unbleached muslin, hand-stitched into the binding with thread that matched the book's original construction, small and invisible. Inside the pocket were 2 sheets of folded paper, thin as onion skin. I unfolded them with trembling hands. The first was written in Tom's blocky handwriting, the same tight engineering script he used on structural drawings. It began, "Laurie, if you are reading this, it means Elaine has shown her true nature. I always knew she would try to take what was yours. I could never prove anything while I was alive because she was careful, but I recognized the same pattern from when she squeezed our parents' estate. I took precautions. The real agreement is with this note. I filed a UCC-1 financing statement on the collection in your name the month we paid for it, listing you as the secured party for the full value of the IRA distribution. That lien creates a security interest that can never be released without your notarized signature. Use it. I love you. Trust no one but yourself. The second sheet was our original partnership agreement, not the one Patricia notarized at the kitchen table, but a separate, self-executing agreement that Tom had drafted and filed with the county clerk the same week I signed the first. It explicitly stated that my cash purchase of the buttons gave me a 55% equity stake and unilateral veto power over any sale of the entire collection. It incorporated the UCC lien by reference, making the buttons themselves my collateral. Tom had also attached a notarized affidavit from a forensic document examiner who had analyzed Patricia's earlier notarization and flagged it as potentially fraudulent because the stamp number did not match the county record. The examiner had left a note at the bottom: signature irregularities detected. Suspect notary stamp was duplicated without authorization. Tom had known. He had known and had built me a legal fortress inside a book of ribbons. I stared at that page until my vision blurred. Tom had built a dead man's switch into my insurance policy, and Elaine had no idea it existed. The ribbon sample book that she had called old junk and tossed into a donation box was, in fact, the one object that could destroy her. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truest thread in any family is not blood, but the one you stitch with your own hands. I did not sleep that night. I made a digital copy of every page using the scanner on my printer, uploaded the files to a secure cloud folder, and printed a duplicate that I sealed in a waterproof envelope and buried under a loose floorboard in my bedroom closet. Then I returned the originals to the muslin pocket and carefully reglued the end paper with archival adhesive, making it appear untouched. Then I crafted a plan built on appearing weak. The next morning I called Elaine and told her my head was still spinning from the numbers and I thought I might need to see my doctor. My voice trembled, a performance I had practiced in front of the bathroom mirror. I asked if I could stay with her for a few days, just so I wouldn't be alone. There was a long pause, long enough for me to hear Mark's muffled voice in the background, and then Elaine's voice turned syrupy. Of course, sweetheart, your family. Mark will pick you up this afternoon. The trap was set. Mark arrived in a too-clean SUV, the kind leased for image, and he helped me carry a small overnight bag as if I were an invalid. He spoke to me in a slow, loud voice, the way you talk to a child or a pet. I shuffled. I paused mid-sentence as if I had lost my train of thought. I wore a cardigan with a tissue stuffed in the sleeve and a pair of orthopedic-looking shoes I had bought at a thrift store. The performance was exhausting, but it bought me time to watch. And what I watched was alarming. They put me in a guest room decorated in beige and taupe, every surface soft and neutral like a showroom designed to erase personality. The room had a keypad lock on the door that they explained was for my safety because I might wander. Elaine punched in the code 1-9-5-7 and made sure I saw her do it as if I were too foggy to remember. I memorized it instantly. The lock was one of those battery-operated interior models, easy to override from the inside if you removed the faceplate, which I could do with a seam ripper in 10 seconds. But I never needed to escape because they were not holding me prisoner. They were holding me as a prop, a forgetful old woman who would sign anything they put in front of her. That first night, lying in the dark under a duvet that smelled like synthetic lavender, I began to observe. The walls were thin, and the HVAC vents carried sound from the lower floor. I heard Mark take frantic phone calls at all hours, pacing the deck and hissing into his cell about bridge financing and balloon payments. He used phrases like hard money lender, debt service coverage ratio, and cash-on-cash return. I recognized them from the investment seminars Tom and I had attended before he died. Mark was terrified. I overheard him say, "The collection has to move within 30 days or the lien holder calls the note, and we are personally on the hook for the whole principal." I realized then that they were not just borrowing against the sale, they were leveraging the collection as collateral for other debts, stacking liabilities on top of liabilities like a house of cards. Elaine spent money like a lottery winner who expected the check to bounce. A new Mercedes SUV appeared in the driveway, the window sticker still taped to the inside glass, showing a price of $84,000. Fresh orchids arrived every Tuesday in a refrigerated van. I found an invoice in the kitchen trash for a $10,000 dinner party at a private dining club titled Investor Relations. The itemized list included truffle risotto, a sommelier-selected wine flight, and a brand storytelling consultation. They were performing wealth they did not yet possess, burning through borrowed money on the assumption that the Maison Dubois sale would close before anyone noticed. But thanks to Tom's lien, that sale could never close without my cooperation, and they had no idea I was the person who held the keys. One afternoon, while Elaine was out at a spin class and the house was quiet, the garbage disposal jammed. I heard the grinding noise from my room, followed by a sharp clunk and then the sound of water gurgling. A few minutes later, Mark was in the kitchen, jabbing a broom handle into the drain and cursing. Water began leaking from under the sink cabinet, pooling on the hardwood. I shuffled into the kitchen, my cardigan buttoned unevenly, and asked if I could help. He sneered and said, "Unless you've got a plumber in that cardigan, Laurie, just go sit down." I told him I used to fix industrial sewing machines backstage, and that a disposal was not much different, just a motor and an impeller. He stared at me for a moment, then waved a hand dismissively and left me to it, retreating to his office to take another angry call. I got down on my knees, ignoring the ache in my joints. I reached under the sink, disconnected the trap with a half-turn of the slip nut, and caught the foul water in a bowl I found nearby. The spoon, a heavy stainless steel piece with a twisted handle, was wedged between the impeller plate and the grinding ring. I used a pair of needle-nose pliers from the junk drawer to work it free, then reassembled the pipes, tightening the compression gasket until it seated properly. I wiped the seal with a rag, flipped the switch, and the disposal hummed like a sewing machine at full speed. The leak stopped. When I stood up and wiped my hands on a dish towel, I saw Mark standing in the doorway, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression a mixture of surprise and unease. The helpless old lady had a skill set he did not, and that rattled something deep in his lizard brain. He did not thank me. He just said good and walked away. But I knew he had registered the anomaly, and I filed that moment away. That night while they slept, I explored. Elaine had a home office tucked behind the laundry room, a space that was always locked when she was not in it. The door had a standard interior knob with a push-button lock on the outside, trivial to bypass with a thin blade. More importantly, the filing cabinet in the corner had a tubular cam lock, the kind found in basic office furniture. Years ago, my father ran a shoe repair shop, and I used to pick the locks on the customer lockers when people lost their keys, just using a bent awl and a stiff piece of wire. I improvised tools from my sewing kit, a barbie pin bent into a tension wrench and the smallest seam ripper, its blade thin enough to reach the pin tumblers. I knelt in the dark, listening to the soft click-tick of the pin setting, and within 90 seconds the lock turned. Inside were manila folders labeled with the names of shell companies that meant nothing to me: Lemon Drop Holdings LLC, Bissu Merchant Capital, Florentine Partners. One folder contained the forged dissolution document bearing my signature. I held it under the light of my phone screen and saw that my name was signed in a looping, exaggerated cursive with an oversized capital L, nothing like my tight, print-like handwriting. Beside the signature was a notary stamp that matched the one Patricia had used on the original partnership agreement, the one the forensic examiner had flagged as suspicious. Another folder held the original offer letter from Mason Dubois, printed on thick cream stationery with the house's monogram. The letter included a critical clause: the sale was contingent on a clear title and negative lien search results. If any security interest appeared on the collateral, the deal was voidable. Elaine had initialed that clause herself, which meant she knew the risk. She was betting the bank would not find the UCC, a dangerous and stupid gamble. The third folder was the most damning. It contained the loan agreement Mark had executed with a private investment firm called Sentinel Bridge Capital. The loan was for $250,000, with a balloon payment due in 60 days, and an interest rate of 18%. The collateral was listed as a collection of antique glass buttons and silk passementerie, currently located at 1427 Magnolia Lane, my house, and the co-signer was listed as Loretta Ann Coleman, me. My signature there was the same clumsy forgery. They had buried me in debt I never knew existed, and they intended to let the sale collapse after they had already spent the bridge loan, leaving me to face the liability alone. The paperwork even included a personal guarantee that claimed I had pledged my home as additional security. I felt the blood drain from my face. I photographed every page with my phone, careful to capture the dates, the forged signatures, the notary stamp numbers. Then I returned the folders precisely as I had found them, locked the cabinet and sat in the dark of my beige room, allowing myself a single, silent cry. Not for them, but for the brother Tom had been and the sister Elaine had become. The next day brought an unexpected ally. I received a call on my cell phone, the number unknown. A woman introduced herself as Mrs. Genevieve Carter, Senior Compliance Officer at First Mercantile Bank, the institution that Mason Dubois had engaged to handle the international wire transfer. She said that during the bank's routine lien search, a standard uniform commercial code search they ran before any large transfer, They had discovered a UCC-1 filing from 2 years prior listing Loretta Ann Coleman as the secured party on a collection of antique buttons. She had also noticed a recent financing statement from Sentinel Bridge Capital that listed me as a co-signer, but the signature on file with Sentinel did not match the specimen on the UCC or the signatures they had from my personal accounts. She was investigating potential fraud and wondered if I could come to her office for a confidential conversation. Her voice was calm, professional, and carried the weight of someone who had seen a dozen schemes like this before. I told her I would arrive the following Tuesday with the evidence she needed, and I made her promise not to alert Elaine or Mark. She agreed and gave me the address of a secure branch location, not the main lobby, where we could meet without anyone noticing. I spent that weekend gathering everything, the digital photos, the original hidden agreement, which I retrieved from the sample book, carefully leaving the book itself in my room so Elaine would not suspect, and a written timeline of events. I placed the documents in a manila envelope and sealed it with packing tape, then hid it under the spare tire in my trunk overnight. On Tuesday, while Elaine and Mark were at a brand partnership lunch, I pretended to nap. I drove to the bank, met Mrs. Carter in a small conference room with soundproofed walls, and handed over the evidence. She was a sharp woman in her 60s, with silver hair and a face that had spent decades reading financial statements. She reviewed the forgeries under a magnifying lamp, compared the signatures to my known exemplars, and nodded slowly. She said, "This is enough to trigger a federal investigation. I will contact the U.S. Attorney's Financial Crimes Task Force." She asked me to participate in the final confrontation, to be present when the trap closed, and I agreed. She gave me a small digital recorder disguised as a pen, and said to keep it with me. The following Saturday I staged the final test. I had found an old theatrical blood capsule in my sewing kit, a prop left over from a production of Macbeth I had costumed years earlier. It was small, filled with non-toxic red gel that looked terrifyingly real when crushed between the teeth. I spent the morning rehearsing a fall in my room, remembering the way actors collapsed onstage, loose and heavy. At 2 in the afternoon I walked into the living room where Elaine was sorting colour swatches on the coffee table, and Mark was reviewing a stack of contracts, their backs to the window. I clutched my chest, let out a short gasp, and dropped. I made sure to clip the edge of the coffee table with my elbow on the way down, sending a stack of magazines flying. The blood capsule broke against my molars, and a thin trickle of red oozed from the corner of my mouth, seeping onto the beige carpet. I lay utterly still, eyes half closed, breathing shallowly through my nose. What happened next was a cold, perfect confirmation of everything I needed to know. Elaine glanced up from her swatches, saw me on the floor, and then looked directly past me at the scattered loan documents on the sofa. She stepped over my body without hesitation, careful not to scuff her sandals on my outstretched arm, and scooped the papers into her arms before Mark could notice. She carried them into the kitchen and slid them into a drawer, then came back and stood over me with her hands on her hips. Mark watched me for a few seconds, said, "Laurie, get up, this isn't funny," in a flat voice, and then turned back toward the window as if I were a houseplant that had tipped over. Nobody dialed 911. Nobody knelt beside me. The only sound was the tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of the HVAC. I lay there for 2 full minutes, my heart thudding against the floor, and when I finally coughed and stirred, Elaine said, "Oh, there you are, you gave me a fright," in a voice as flat as dead silk. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not offer me a hand up. She just nudged the carpet fibers with her toe and said, "You'll need to clean that stain." I knew then that any residual family loyalty I had felt was completely extinguished. That night I recorded a detailed memo on my phone, describing the fall, their reactions, and the exact timestamps, and I transferred the file to the cloud folder. The confrontation was set for Thursday at the bank. Elaine told me we were going to sign the final documents, and I would receive my loyalty credit. She helped me into the same cardigan, buckled me into the back seat of the Mercedes like a piece of luggage, and patted my knee with a smile that was all teeth. Mark drove, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, nervous about something, maybe the ticking clock on the bridge loan. We walked into First Mercantile's secure branch, a discreet building with a marble lobby and frosted glass offices, and were escorted by a plainclothes security guard to a conference room on the 3rd floor. Inside, Mrs. Carter waited with a notary, a bank attorney, and 2 special agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, their credentials clipped to their belts. The room smelled of stale coffee and ozone. A digital recording device sat in the center of the table, its red light glowing. Elaine beamed and slid a sheaf of papers toward me, pointing to a yellow signature flag on the last page. "Just right there, Laurie, and we're all done and we can go get lunch," she sang. The document was the dissolution and transfer, the same fraudulent one, but this time with a new attachment. A release of the UCC lien which they had finally discovered existed and had frantically drafted, hoping I would sign it without reading. Their desperation was transparent. I let my hand hover over the pen, my fingers trembling in the performance. Then I straightened my spine, dropped the quavering old woman voice and looked Elaine directly in the eye. I said in a tone that had not been foggy for weeks, "I am not signing away what my husband locked down for me twice." Elaine's smile flickered, then collapsed like a cheap hem. She opened her mouth to protest, but the agents were already moving. One placed cuffs on Mark's wrists while the other read Elaine her Miranda rights. "Mrs. Carter presented the original UCC filing, the forged dissolution, the fraudulent Sentinel Bridge loan, and the forensic document examiner's affidavit." I slid Tom's hidden partnership agreement, still smelling faintly of old ribbon glue, across the table, and I placed the digital recorder on top of it. The bank attorney, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, declared the Mason Dubois sale null and void due to clouded title and material misrepresentation. The collection, all 12 crates of it, was legally and unequivocally mine. The aftermath was both swift and deeply satisfying. Elaine and Mark were charged with 7 counts of felony fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and identity theft. The FBI's forensic audit of their finances uncovered a trail of predatory loans, falsified tax returns, and an additional embezzlement scheme involving a small trim importer in New Jersey. Their entire financial facade was a Ponzi-like spiral built on bad faith and stolen signatures. Both pled guilty in a plea deal that included 18 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and full restitution of every penny they had attempted to steal, including the $250,000 Sentinel Bridge loan, which they were now personally liable for and which immediately pushed them into bankruptcy. The Mercedes was repossessed from the prison parking lot. Their house went into foreclosure, and the auction notice was published in the local paper the same week I opened my own shop. In the fashion district, their names became a cautionary joke whispered at trade shows. I received the button collection free and clear, along with a settlement from First Mercantile for the bank's own administrative negligence in not flagging the notary discrepancy earlier, an amount that covered my legal fees and provided a cushion for the new business. I rented a retail space on a brick-lined street downtown, a former millinery shop with high tin ceilings and wood display cases that had been built in 1912. I opened the store under the name button of Deceit Trims. The front window displays our signature product, antique glass buttons graded by rarity and mounted on cream-colored card stock. Every card is printed with a small line at the bottom that reads, "Federal Case No. 2, 24 CR 01578A, ensuring your trims are true." It is not a marketing gimmick. It is a provenance of justice, a reminder that what you buy here is legally clean and ethically sourced. As part of her supervised release, Elaine was ordered to complete 300 hours of community service. The judge, a woman who had read the entire case file and visibly winced at the details of the staged collapse, asked me if I had a preference for where the community service might be performed. I requested that Elaine report to my shop every Tuesday and Thursday from 9 until 5. She arrives in a county van, wearing a canvas smock that I had embroidered with the words "Unraveled Promises" across the back in crimson thread. Her job is to sit at a sorting station in the back room, beside the window where passers-by can see, and organize buttons by size, material, and era. She uses a digital caliper that measures to the 1/10 of a millimeter and a brass gauge that must be cleaned with a polishing cloth between each batch. She is not permitted to speak to customers, though occasionally a shopper will peer through the glass and ask who the woman in the smock is. I smile and say, my former business partner, learning the value of a single button, it turns out each one is worth far more than her loyalty. I think about Tom every day. I have his note, the one from the ribbon sample book, framed on the wall behind the register. Beneath it I hung a single antique ribbon, a piece of silk taffeta from the 1880s, the color of dried roses. It turns out the quietest architect can build you a fortress from the other side of death, if you paid attention when he was alive. The moral of my story is not complicated. Some people believe that family bonds are invisible threads that can stretch but will never break. In my experience, if you don't reinforce those threads with truth and accountability, they unravel faster than cheap polyester, and often right when you need them to hold. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments if you believe that the real heirloom isn't the button but the integrity of the hand that sews it on. Then hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. I'll be back with another story soon. Until then, keep your seams strong and your receipts stronger.